So, I'm James Lakey. I'll be your first affirmative speaker. Thank you very much for judging.
My name's Alyssa. I'll be your second affirmative speaker. Thank you so much.
I'm Maggie Topper. I'll be your second negative. Thank you for judging.
That'll be me. Yeah, good evening, ma'am. My name is Adrian Ford. I'll be your first negative. Thank you very much for judging. Hey, thanks for timing.
No problem.
So, before we get started, is there any previous judging experience, philosophy you have, or things that you really like to see or really don't like to see in the round that you could tell us about?
Okay, the thing that I'll tell you is this is only my second day of judging. My first day was yesterday, so I am new at this. There is nothing in particular that I do or do not want to see. I'm too new to have a preference.
Myself too. All right, great. Then, if everyone is ready, all right. Thomas Jefferson once said, "When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. But when the government fears the people, then there is liberty." It is because we as the affirmative team agree with this statement and believe that while the American government has always been established in such a way that it does fear the people, but in this round we can raise that standard even higher, that we stand resolved that the United States federal government should substantially reform its electronic surveillance law. In this round, we'd like to stress the point that there is no significant harm in the status quo. Therefore, the affirmative team is not trying to solve for any particular problem. Instead, the significance of our plan will come from the great advantages it will lead to. With all that in mind, let's look to the one important background point we'd like to establish, that there is no consistent standard for evidence in the current system. Again, that is background point one, no consistent standard. In order for physical evidence to be acceptable to a court, law enforcement must have had a warrant based on probable cause to seize that evidence, and the owner must have been informed of the seizure. However, these same requirements do not apply to electronic evidence, which is both far more common and far more revealing in today's world. Instead, requirements for electronic evidence are surrounded by a confusing forest of red tape, created by conflicting and inconsistent policies. Note that the affirmative team isn't saying that this is a bad thing. It's simply the way things are. The current system does what it is meant to do: protect America from threats at home and abroad while upholding the constitutional rights as they're interpreted. Now let's look to what the affirmative team proposes in order to improve that system and even make it even better at doing those things. Our plan has two mandates. Mandate one, require email warrants. Require email warrants. Mandate one will expand the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 to require all federal agents to possess a court-approved warrant in order to seize email. Mandate two, owner informed. Owner informed. Agents will be required to inform the owner of any email seized within 7 days of that seizure, except in cases where the investigation requires secrecy. These mandates will be enacted through the powers of the Congress, President, and any other necessary bodies of the federal government. The enforcement will be through existing enforcement under the ECPA. No funding will be needed, and the plan will take effect immediately upon an affirmative ballot. Now we'll be showing how the affirmative plan is significant in two different ways: our advocacy and our advantages. Let's start by observing our advocacy in significance point one. Large companies advocate. Large companies advocate. We are not the only ones who see the opportunity for the betterment of the system. Many large companies are currently pushing for ECPA reform, and perhaps the foremost of these is Google, which is currently ranked the 46th largest company in the world according to Fortune magazine. Now this piece of evidence is from Richard Salgado, a spokesperson for Google in 2013. Quote, "Start with our domestic surveillance laws. Google strongly supports legislation that would update the Electronic Communications Privacy Act to require a warrant in all instances where governmental entities want to obtain the content of a user's communications." The article goes on to say, "We urge Congress to pass ECPA reform as soon as possible and resist efforts to include carve-outs and exceptions that would whittle away at this bright line. a warrant for content standard, or deny the truth of users' reasonable expectation of privacy. Google is the largest company in the information technology industry to date. Clearly, anything that they recommend is significant. And again, Google is recommending the very thing that the affirmative team is giving you, a warrant for content bright line. The second place our case gains its significance from is its advantages. We have several advantages, but I'll just be presenting the first two, and then my partner will be bringing up the rest in her speech. Advantage 1, liberty fortified. Liberty fortified. The strength of America comes from her liberty. We are strong because our citizens have the freedom to pursue their own unique interests and ambitions. Without liberty, we would inevitably become just another country struggling against herself to survive. But as former Republican Representative Ernest Istook contends, America's strength is not just our diversity. Our strength is our ability to unite people of different backgrounds around common principles. Just one of those important principles is our privacy. In the status quo, there are many laws intended to safeguard our privacy, but there are now so many that they've started countering each other and confusing the system. By passing a single, clear standard, we will bolster the cause of privacy and secure that right completely. Advantage 2 is consistent policy. Consistent policy. Now this advantage has two subpoints. Subpoint A, status quo is confusing. Again, that status quo is confusing. By the Digital Due Process Coalition in 2010. Quote, the ECPA is a patchwork of confusing standards that have been interpreted inconsistently by the courts, creating uncertainty, end quote. Subpoint B is President's Council Advocacy. President's Council Advocacy. This is by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in 2014. Quote, Congress should amend the ECPA to ensure the standard of protection for online digital content is consistent with that afforded in the physical world. Basically what they're saying is that we need the affirmative team's warrant for content standard in order to not only make requirements for electronic evidence consistent, but bring that up to the same level of consistency as the world of physical evidence is. Now with all these points on the flow, let's spend the last couple minutes of this speech ensuring that the affirmative plan is explicitly clear. Now in Mandate 1, I mentioned the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which we'll be referring to as ECPA from here on out. This is currently the overarching law of the electronic surveillance that occurs around the US, specifically in the area of email collection. The only problem is that in 1986, when this law was passed, only about 15 emails total had ever been sent, which basically means that Congress had no idea the amount of protection that this new technology was going to require. There have been many amendments to this bill since, including the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and the Patriot Act. But these bills have gotten to the point where they're now confusing both the system and law enforcement that have to abide by them. By passing a single universally applicable law that creates a very simple guideline, we will make things much clearer for federal agents, especially since they've already been following this same rule for physical evidence for years. This rule is very simple. If you are looking to access and collect the contents of a communication, you must possess a court-approved warrant. That is what we call our warrant for content standard, and you'll be hearing us use that term quite a bit throughout the next hour and a half. Again, I'd just like to reiterate, this round is not asking you to decide whether or not the affirmative team can fix a problem. Instead, what it is asking you to do is compare the advantages with the affirmative team with the advantages of the status quo. The status quo cannot grant you any additional advantages as it is static, while the affirmative team grants you many. And it's for that very simple reason an affirmative ballot is warranted. Thank you.
How are you doing, James?
I'm just fine. How are you, Maggie?
I'm doing great. So first of all, let's look at your mandates. Your first mandate was that of requiring email warrants. Now, is the email warrants that you are requiring, is that for every single email that is ever looked into?
Yes. If they'd like to collect an email, they need a warrant. That's the warrant for content standard.
Now, are warrants required in the status quo at all?
For part of the time, not all of it. Again, it's an inconsistent standard.
Okay, all right. Now, your mandate 2 is that of informing the owner, and then I believe you mentioned an exception of that of except when secrecy is required, correct?
Correct.
Now, can you explain what situations would require secrecy?
Basically, anything that would either endanger the life of somebody who found out that evidence was being collected from them, such as a witness protection circumstance, or just any type of national security problem in which we basically wouldn't want the person that we're looking into to know that we're looking into them.
Great. So, what is the purpose of government bodies surveying our emails? Why do they do that?
It's for our own protection.
It's for our protection. Okay, so when they're searching our emails, it's in order to protect us, correct?
Correct.
Okay, now you talked about how large companies are advocating this plan. Are the large companies like Google, for instance, are they taking any action at this time? Are they requiring warrants from the government?
Legally, a company unfortunately can't basically tell the government that they're not going to give them stuff. They have been basically fighting an uphill battle, attempting to get the government to pass this standard, but really the most that they can do is advocate it.
Great, we'll talk about that. So why does Google advocate this? Did you explain why they advocate it?
They advocate it basically because they think that this would bolster the cause of privacy, and as a company, that is something that they stand for.
So do you think that Google then would believe that our privacy is being harmed right now?
I haven't seen any evidence to that point.
Okay, all right. Now, you talked about in your Advantage 1 that of liberty being fortified. How exactly will liberty be fortified by requiring email warrants? What does that have to do with our liberty?
Essentially, without when there is no consistent standard, there is a possibility that loopholes can be either available to be breached or anything like that. Essentially, just by creating one consistent standard, we make everything very clear and are absolutely sure that this right, our liberty, is secured.
But how does that confusion or that lack of confusion that you'll be trying to create, how will that fortify our liberty? How will that affect our personal freedoms in any way?
Basically, it will make absolutely sure that if a federal agent for some reason wants to read your emails, has any reason to suspect that you might have important information in a investigation, they will observe all of your rights when looking at it.
Starting negative section.
I'm good. Looks like the judge and the timer are both ready. And the affirmative team. All right, let's go and get started. All right, Judge, what I'm going to be doing is a pretty straightforward first negative constructive. I'm just going to be going down the bill, presenting quite a bit of argumentation, really proving to you that right now the affirmative team's plan has already been passed, really showing you that right now the government has to notify people, right now the government has to get warrants, and essentially there's no need for the affirmative team's plan. So let's go and jump right in there. Starting off with my first point, you can label this as companies fighting back. That is, again, companies fighting back. Now, Mr. Lakey came up in his first speech and he stated the fact like, oh, it's an uphill battle, so they're not actually doing anything, especially Google, they want to do something but they can't. That's not true. According to the Electronic Freedom Foundation, November 4th of 2014, just a couple months ago, they stated, quote, we've asked the companies in the Who Has Your Back program what they are doing to bolster encryption in the light of the NSA's unlawful surveillance of your communications. As of now, 8 companies, Dropbox, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Sonic.net, Spider Oak, Twitter, and Yahoo have implemented 5 out of the 5 of our best practices for encryption. These service providers have taken a critical step towards protecting their users from that warrantless seizure of their information off of our fiber optic cables by encrypting their network. Service providers can make the backdoor surveillance more challenging and require the government to go to the courts and use the legal process. They are getting rid of that warrantless seizure, that unlawful seizure, making the government go to the courts and use the legal process. Again, that was only from a couple months ago. This is not an uphill battle that the companies are fighting. The companies are actually winning. But with that being said, now let's go ahead and address my next point, talking about the fact that the affirmative team essentially doesn't have an inherent barrier. Now, before I jump into my argument, you may be asking, okay, what's an inherent barrier? Let me really quickly explain that. An inherent barrier is essentially something that stops the affirmative team's plan from passing. An inherent barrier is something that is required of an affirmative team to have. And since there is no inherent barrier to the affirmative plan, there's no need to pass it, since the status quo is already working to solve the problem. The problem being the jumbled up system, the warrants, warrant list, those kind of things. That has already been solved. And you can label this inherent barrier point as the EPA. That is, again, the EPA. Now, EPA is the Email Privacy Act. John Eggerson, June of 2014, writes, according to legislators and others, a bill protecting email privacy has enough votes to pass in the House if it is brought up for a vote. The Email Privacy Act has 218 co-sponsors, according to the Computer and Communications Industry Association, whose members include Microsoft, Google, eBay, Dish, Arrow, Sprint, and T-Mobile. The bill would change the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, or the ECPA, to require a warrant before the ISPs would have to be disclosed the contents of the email communications. Again, the affirmative team does not have an inherent barrier. There's nothing stopping their plan from happening. In fact, the status quo has already begun to solve the problem. But with that being said, now let's go ahead and jump on to my next points. And these points are going to be significance arguments, essentially showing their plan isn't as significant and as big as they would like you to believe. You can label my first point as search warrants are the norm. Because again, search warrants are the norm. Ellen Nakashimi, writing on March of 2013, stated, quote, in practice, since a 2010 ruling by the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit requiring a warrant for stored email by most large commercial email providers such as Google and Yahoo. They have adopted that standard. Judge, search warrants have been the norm, and they have been required in the practice since 2010. This plan has become irrelevant 5 years ago. There is no need for the affirmative team's plan now. Search warrants are already the norm. They are already required. But if you don't like that piece of evidence, let's go ahead and look to my next piece of evidence, which you can label as search warrants default. That is, again, my next piece of evidence, search warrants default. Samini Sengupta, April of 2013, writes, quote, Facebook says it turns over content created by users only after it has been served with a warrant. Twitter too says that requests for contents of a communication require a search warrant. It informs users when it receives a request for the information from a government agency. Microsoft, which operates emails and cloud storage services, follows the similar practice, insisting on a warrant for the content. The affirmative team would like you to believe that these companies, they're powerless. That's not the fact. The fact of the matter is the companies have the power, the companies can force the government to get warrants, and the companies have been doing so since, this piece of evidence, since 2013. Since 2 years ago, the companies have been doing this. This is not a problem. But if you don't believe any of the arguments that I presented so far, if you don't believe any of them, let's go ahead and look to my next point. My next point you can label as the third-party doctrine. That is, again, the third-party doctrine. Now, before I get into this piece of evidence, I'm just going to really quickly explain why this is so important. Essentially, the third-party doctrine is a constitutional rule that states, essentially, privacy is not being violated because of this doctrine. This is a Supreme Court ruling. This is a Supreme Court rule that the Supreme Court has made regarding the Constitution. It says that privacy is actually not being violated, the Fourth Amendment specifically. So with that being said, now let's go ahead and look at my evidence. December of 2013, The Atlantic writes, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government, observing that, and I quote the decision, this court, the Supreme Court, consistently has held that a person has no legitimate expectation of privacy in the information that he voluntarily turns over to third parties. The Smith ruling also made reference to the United States versus Miller. In Miller, the Supreme Court has also found in favor of the government, writing, again, quoting the decision, the depositor takes the risk in revealing his affairs to another that the information will be conveyed by the person to the government. This court has also repeatedly held that the Fourth Amendment does not prohibit the obtaining of information revealed to a third party. So, Judge, even if you don't agree with the third-party doctrine, even if you believe that it's total baloney, malarkey, whatever kind of fancy words you want to think up for not true, I would like you to very much so remember this quotation. This court has held repeatedly that the Fourth Amendment does not prohibit obtaining the information. Even without the third-party doctrine, even if the third-party doctrine didn't exist, the Supreme Court has ruled the Fourth Amendment does not prohibit it. They do not need a warrant because privacy is not being violated. So looking back at the flow, what have we seen? We've seen the fact that companies are fighting back. We've seen the fact that the government is fighting back with the Email Privacy Act. We've seen the fact with two separate pieces of evidence that warrants, they're already required. They're the norm. They're the default. And we've also seen that the government has to go through the courts, has to use the legal process, and the companies are absolutely winning this battle. And finally, if you didn't believe any of that, it doesn't even violate privacy because of what the Supreme Court ruled in the third-party doctrine. So for all these reasons, I ask that you stand with my partner and I and vote for the perfectly working system that is already requiring the warrants. Thank you.
That is 4 minutes, okay. There we go. We're gonna press it at the exact same time. Didn't work. All right, how are you doing today, Adrian?
Pretty tired. How about yourself, James?
Also very tired. Probably not as much as you because I don't do probably. But regardless,
Okay.
let's get into the meat of your speech.
Sure.
Starting nearish the top.
Okay.
Now, is an encryption the same thing as a warrant for content standard?
The encryption is not the same as a warrant, but it's just showing that the companies can do other things besides require the warrants.
Okay. Now, is there a guarantee of the EPA passing?
Yes, if it comes up to a vote, it will pass.
It will pass.
It will pass. It will become law.
What will it pass?
It'll pass the president to the House, the Senate, it will pass, it'll become law.
I'm sorry, it's going to pass the president before it passes the House?
Okay, well, not in that order, but it will pass.
Okay, did your evidence specifically state that?
Yeah, it did say that if it comes up to a vote, it will pass.
All right, can I have that evidence, please?
Sure.
All right. Now, why exactly does the affirmative team need an inherent barrier?
Because it proves the fact that you aren't already inherent.
All right. Now, let's look at... Okay, what is the Supreme Court of the land?
The Supreme Court.
The supreme interpreter of law in the land. Yeah.
The Supreme Court.
Okay, not the Sixth Circuit?
No, the Supreme Court.
Okay, can I have the evidence about the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, please?
Which one was that under?
I believe that was under your point about requiring, the point from 2010.
Bob Carr.
Okay. 2010 was 5 years ago. Isn't that so scary?
Terrifying.
We're old. Okay. All right. Now, you brought up a lot of different stuff about the third-party doctrine.
Well, only one card, but yeah.
Oh, you talked about it a lot.
I did.
Okay. All right. Now, you stated that it was a constitutional rule. Where in the Constitution is the third-party doctrine?
Well, that would make it a constitutional amendment. It's not an amendment, it's just a rule that our Supreme Court uses to view the Constitution.
So it's not in the Constitution.
Well, no, but that's not a constitutional rule.
All right. Great. What do you want to do when you grow up?
I'm probably going to finish getting my general education credits through a community college because it's cheap and I'm poor. And then I'll probably transfer into an Arizona university because, again, you get the in-state tuition. I'm from Arizona, so it'll be, again, cheaper because I like saving money. And I'm probably going to get a major in political science, maybe a minor in journalism communications, become a political analyst.
Okay, so talking about politics, when you're weighing one thing against another, what is more important, con law or case law? Constitutional law or case law?
Well, I believe they both hold their weight in court.
All right, but what should be most important if they're ever up against each other?
If they ever come up against each other,
Yes,
the
if they are-
Constitution's the highest law of the land. So
Okay.
it would be that.
All right, thank you. No further questions.
Great.
Okay, starting affirmative prep check.
Can you let us know every 3 seconds, please?
Okay, is the judge ready? And the timer? Affirmative check. According to the White House in 2014, the president's highest priority is to keep the American people safe. It is because the negative team agrees with this that the highest priority of the federal government should be to keep the American people safe, that we believe that passing the affirmative plan will harm the national security of America. So first, let's look at a couple disadvantages before we look at their case. Now, my first disadvantage you can tag as undermines security. Undermines security. This piece of evidence is from October in 2011 from Forbes. It says, Associate Deputy Attorney General James Baker expressed concern that improving privacy protections and enshrining the Warshak decision in the law could hinder government investigations. Not all federal agencies have authority to obtain search warrants. For example, the Security and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, and Federal Trade Commission, FTC, conduct investigations in which they need access to information stored as the content of email. Raising the standard for obtaining stored email or other stored communications to a search warrant could substantially impair their investigations. So that we see is that the SEC does not have the authority to obtain search warrants. The SEC does not have the authority to obtain search warrants. And this next subpoint you can tag as the Justice Department agrees. The Justice Department agrees because the Justice Department agrees that creating this increased access standard is not going to be a good solution because of the SEC. In March, the Washington Post reported the Justice Department does not support a uniform warrant standard for all email. In her testimony, the acting assistant attorney general in the department's Office of Legal Policy argued that civil investigative agencies that do not have warrant authority, such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, must not lose their ability to obtain email with a subpoena. So what we see here is that the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commissions, and the FTC, the Foreign Trade Commissions, they don't have the authority to obtain search warrants, and their job is to protect our security, to protect us from fraud and from different internet criminals. And because of that, because they don't have the authority to obtain search warrants, if you increase the access standard to require search warrants, they will no longer be able to do their job because as their plan does not provide for that in any way. Now, the next disadvantage you can tag as terrorism increased. Terrorism increased. This is from Nick Simeon in the U.S. Department of Defense in 2013. Says the director of the National Security Agency told Congress today that more than 50 terrorist plots worldwide have been prevented since the 9/11 attacks through the classified surveillance programs the government uses to gather internet data. Programs, he said, are legal and do not compromise the privacy and civil liberties of Americans. And so what we see here from this piece of evidence is that because of the programs that are in place now, because of the government's ability that they do not have to obtain search warrants, what they can do currently, they're able to prevent terrorist attacks. 50 terrorist attacks since 9/11. So if you hinder them from being able to do their job, well then we'll see an increase in terrorism because the government won't be able to do their job in protecting us from that. But now let's look at their case. Let's look first at their mandate 2, that of the owner being informed. I have 2 responses. The first is purpose is protection. Purpose is protection. When I asked James in cross-ex, what is the purpose of the government obtaining these, or surveying our emails, and he says, well, it's to protect us. And now in the exception in his mandate, was that the owner will be informed except when secrecy is required. So my second response you can label as secrecy is essential to protection. Secrecy is essential to protection. If the whole purpose that the government surveys our email is to protect us from national security threats, from any sort of security threat, then secrecy is essential to that protection. We can't be telling the people we're surveying that they're being surveyed if the whole purpose is for protection. It's complete contradiction. So now let's look down at their advantage 1, that of liberty fortified. I have 2 responses. First, not connected to liberty. Not connected to liberty. The affirmative case is not connected to promoting liberty or fortifying liberty in any way. What they're doing is requiring the government to obtain search warrants. That has nothing to do with our liberty. That has to do with the government's liberty and what they're able to do, and it's actually impairing the government's liberty. So now let's look at the second response, that of NSA is given broad leeway. NSA is given broad leeway. Barton Gelman, writing for the Washington Post in June of 2014, says that a classified 2010 legal certification and other documents indicate that the NSA has been given a far more elastic authority than previously known, one that allows it to intercept through U.S. companies not just the communications of its overseas targets, but any communications about its targets as well. So what we see from this piece of evidence is that the NSA has a lot of leeway. They are able to, they don't really believe that the rules that are in place now even apply to them. And so because they're given broad leeway, what they're mandating is not really going to accomplish anything. They won't be abiding by those rules because they already believe that the rules don't apply to them. So then the next advantage we'll look at is that of their consistent policy advantage, and I have two responses to this. The first response is that of NSA will not comply. NSA will not comply, kind of going along with what I just talked about, but this is a piece of evidence. It's from Patrick Toomey for writing for the American Civil Liberties Union in June of 2014. It says, in a remarkable legal filing on Friday afternoon, the NSA told a federal court that its spying operations are too massive and technically complex to comply with an order to preserve evidence. The NSA, in other words, now says that it cannot comply with the rules that apply to any other party before a court, the very rules that ensure legal accountability, because it is too big. And so we see here, again, that the NSA believes that, it has more liberty than any other party before a court because it's so big and its operations are so massive. Well, they're not going to obey the laws. They're not going to comply with those laws if they already believe that they don't have to. My second response you can tag as increased access standard is not the solution. Increased access standard is not the solution. This is from the Washington Post in March of 2013. It says, some law enforcement officials said the proposed reforms go too far. If a confusing patchwork of case law had led to uncertainty for providers, then why is elevating the standard of access to probable cause for all electronic communications records the appropriate solution? The extension of warrant protection to other electronic content is a far-reaching expansion of protections which necessitates a probing debate. And so what we see from this piece of evidence is that increasing the access standard is not the solution to all the confusion that they've presented. They say, well, the policy is inconsistent and there's so much confusion within the ECPA and we'll be making consistent policy. But what this piece of evidence is saying is that increasing the access standard isn't going to solve for the confusion. It's not the right place to take because the real problems are involved with the NSA and the structure of the NSA. So now let's look down at the other three advantages that Alyssa brought up in her last speech. Now Adrian will be responding to this mostly in his next speech, but I want to make one point. They will not solve for these. They will not solve for these, and you can tag the reason why as because the problem is the NSA. The problem is the NSA. The problem is that the NSA believes that it has all these far-reaching powers. Now, the NSA has a lot more authority, jurisdiction than just email surveillance. They do phone tapping and wiretapping and all these different sorts of electronic surveillance that will not be solved for with the affirmative plan. All the distrust that is going on is not specifically related to emails. So for all these reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you. And I now stand open for cross-examination.
How you doing today, Maggie?
I'm doing great, Alyssa. How are you?
Pretty good. All right, let's start with your disadvantage talking about the SEC. Would it be fair to categorize the SEC as a criminal investigative agency?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that they are involved in.
All right, so you're talking about the SEC. Did you bring up any evidence stating that the SEC is the only agency that can do their job in that way?
Can you rephrase that question? I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
All right, are you saying that did you bring up any evidence saying that the SEC is the only unique agency that addresses the crime in the stock market, basically?
No, we also talked about the FTC, the Foreign Trade Commission.
All right, so those are the only two that did you bring up evidence that said that those were the only two agencies that are...
Absolutely not, just that those are two of the agencies that will be restricted from doing their job and that they do that job and they'll not be able to.
All right, so I have a couple of general questions just on the negative team's stance in general. So you brought up this evidence saying that the federal agencies and the federals in general don't want these warrant for content standards, correct?
The Justice Department believes
Justice Department.
that'll restrict the SEC.
All right, but your partner brought up evidence of saying that companies do want warrants. So which is the negative team supporting? Either the federal agents that don't want the warrants, or the companies that do want the warrants?
Both of them. We believe the federal government does not want the warrants, and the companies are part of the private sector, not part of the federal government, so they can definitely have a different opinion than the federal government.
All right, but are you advocating both positions at the same time?
We're not advocating that we're advocating that your plan is not the right plan to pass. All that we were saying that the company's fighting back is that there's no reason to pass your plan because it's already happening. We're not saying we advocate what those companies are doing.
All right, thank you. So let's go down to disadvantage 2, talking about terrorism. What was your source under that piece of evidence?
You said that really fast.
Your source under the piece of evidence.
The source under the piece of evidence.
For the terrorism?
Just a second, let me find that. You can ask another question.
All right, when we're talking about physical evidence and warrant notification, basically you're saying that we're notifying the person who surveyed.
Correct. You said that you're going to be informing the owner, whoever.
All right, but isn't it true that the law enforcement agency and also the federal government does this with physical evidence as well without notifying the person who was surveyed?
Do you mean that they take evidence without notifying?
Yeah, in the physical world, that they're doing the surveillance, that they're doing without actually tipping off the person, and we're actually applying that standard onto electronic evidence as well.
That's not the standard that you're implying. You're informing the owner, whereas with physical evidence, they don't inform the owner.
Thank you.
Okay, so by the way, the piece of evidence for the disadvantage 2 was from the U.S. Department of Defense.
All right, did you actually do any evidence from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union?
Yes, we did quote some.
All right, can I have that evidence, please?
Yeah, let's find that. Yes, there you go.
All right, thank you.
You have 3 minutes and 10 seconds.
Judge and Tower, both ready? Great. Affirmative team? All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, Judge, I'm going to be doing a pretty straightforward first negative rebuttal. I'm going to be responding to the responses to my responses. So let's go ahead and jump right in there. But before I jump into actually my argumentation, I would just like to start off with one simple observation. You can label this observation as government and companies. As again, government and companies. When Mr. Lakey comes up and says we can't support both the companies and the government, we actually can. Now the reason why we can is because 1, the companies not only want search warrants, they actually have the search warrants, therefore the affirmative team's plan is not needed. 2, the government doesn't want the search warrants because they can't use them because it impedes their work. Essentially, the affirmative team now has to prove that 1, the companies actually don't have search warrants, but 2, the government can operate with the search warrants. They have to prove both standards. We can have companies and we can have government. So disregard the argument if Mr. Lakey makes it that we can't have both. So with that being said, now let's go and jump right in, starting off with the advantages that Alyssa brought up in her last speech. Starting off with advantage number 3, the foreign relation. Now they said foreign relation is the problem, and China doesn't trust Google, Apple, and Microsoft. You can label my response as Google, Apple, and Microsoft require warrants. Google, Apple, Microsoft require warrants. Remember, way back in my very first speech, I brought up 2 pieces of evidence dealing with warrants. 1 was from the 6th Circuit Court. The second one was dealing with Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, Yahoo, Sonic.net, Spider Oak, all of these massive service providers. And what do all of these massive service providers require? They require, not suggest, not saying, hey guys, you should do this. No, they require search warrants. So those companies that China's so-called upset with, as of November of last year, they're no longer upset with them. But now, that being said, let's go ahead and move on to their next 2 advantages. The $180 billion in promotes business. I'm going to clump together. You can label my response, NSA scrutiny. This is again NSA scrutiny. I'm just kind of tagging on to what my partner said in her last speech. Now this piece of evidence is from Barton Gellman in August of 2013. The National Security Agency has broken privacy rules and overstepped its legal authority thousands of times each year since Congress granted the agency its broad powers in 2008. Now why is this so important? The affirmative team is only dealing with, if you look to their mandate, Mandate 1, the only one dealing with warrants is email warrants. Email. The NSA does way more than email. They violate privacy everywhere, 1,000 times a year, more than just email. They deal with more than just email. That is what the people are upset about with the NSA. Since the affirmative team is not dealing with everything that's the problem with the NSA, they can't claim these advantages. NSA is the problem, they're not solving the problem. Now, that being said, let's go on and jump into some of the other responses that Alyssa made in her last speech. She said in response to companies fighting back that there's increased protection, we're helping the companies, all those great things. In response to increased protection, you can label my response as legal process. That is, again, legal process. Again, I asked you to look at the evidence after the round. It says these companies, they're making, not suggesting, not saying, hey guys, you should totally do this. They're making the government go to the court, use the legal process. What's the legal process? A warrant. There's no need for the affirmative team's plan. The companies have already dealt with it. Now, their next argument is saying we should help the companies. You can label my response, they don't need it. They don't need it. The companies have already proven completely capable of fixing the problem by themselves, and they have fixed the problem by themselves. In response to the EPA, they said that this is a low probability, it's probably not going to happen. My first response, no date for the card. No date for the card. This piece of evidence that the affirmative team read did not have a date. It just should be disregarded completely just because of that. But my second response, negative evidence outweighs. Negative evidence outweighs. The piece of evidence that I brought up was from 2014, last year, and it said the fact that if it comes up for a vote, it not might pass, it might not probably pass, it will pass. It already has enough votes, it just needs to be put up for one. The affirmative team's plan will pass 100% as soon as this is brought up for a vote. Now moving down, they talked about the fact of the Sixth Circuit only, dealing with the warrants. You can label my response, plan advocate also. Plan advocate also. Their plan advocate is Google. I brought up a piece of evidence saying Google already requires warrants, along with Microsoft, along with Yahoo, along with Facebook, along with Twitter, along with all these other major service providers. There's no need for the affirmative team's plan. Not only has their plan advocate dealt with it, all of these other massive service providers have as well. Looking down really quickly to the third-party doctrine, you can label my quick response to both as the newest ruling. This is again the newest ruling. The Supreme Court looks to the newest ruling when dealing with their rulings. As this third-party doctrine is the newest ruling, third-party doctrine still stands. Privacy is not being violated. For these reasons, I ask for a negative ballot.
Now, I have a lot of things that I'm going to have to cover in a very short span of time, but before I get into any line-by-line argumentation or any of the real meat of my speech, I'd just like to make two things explicitly clear in this round, and those are two general observations about this round. The first is that the affirmative team believes that the status quo is innocent, which means everything that the negative team has said is wrong with the status quo bears actually absolutely no bearing on this round whatsoever, because the status quo is innocent. They can't change the status quo even if it is flawed, and if it is flawed, we are making it better. Therefore, under those circumstances, the only way to vote is AF. Secondly, the second thing that I would like to note is that the affirmative team has fiat power. The affirmative team has fiat power, which basically means that everything that they've said about the NSA has lots of loopholes for them to exploit. Secondly, even if NSA isn't obeying current law, they will be obeying our law, because we have the fiat power to say this law will be passed and it will be enforced, and therefore the NSA is going to have to obey because of the enforcement that exists. Let's move down over the actual argumentation. I'm going to be starting with Maggie's first couple points. In direct response to Mandate 2, she said that first protect these warrants, or excuse me, warrants are served for our own protection, and then secondly, our secrecy is essential to protection. My response is agreed. Agreed. That's why we have this part of the mandate in there. The secrecy is essential for protection sometimes, and when secrecy is essential for protection, we grant them secrecy. So the affirmative team and the negative team are completely agreed on this point, and we are establishing that. Let's move down to the disadvantages. Oh my goodness, the disadvantage. I have so many different responses to this. Let's start with my first response, which is actually double bind. Double bind. Now, the funny thing is that the negative team has really contradicted themselves within this round. Because on one hand, they're saying that our plan is completely and totally inherent. First of all, because the EPA is about to be passed. It's not, by the way, but that's at least somewhat beside the point of this argument. But first, the EPA is about to be passed, and secondly, all of these servers are already requiring warrants. Judge, if all these servers were already requiring warrants, then we would already be seeing our stock market crashing because the SEC can't do their job, and we'd already see terrorism spiking. We see neither of those things, so obviously warrants will not cause these. So their disadvantages are off the table. Let's move into the inherency of the EPA. Now, under the EPA, I'd like to make just one quick response to this. Adrian has come up and claimed multiple times now that his evidence stated that if this bill came up to vote, that it would be passed. I'd like to make two quick notes about this that are very important. The first is that it says if. We have no guarantee whatsoever that this bill even will be brought up to vote. The second is that his evidence specifically said it would pass the House. The House. Not the entire Congress and the President's desk. At least that's what he read it as. So if I'm unclear as to what that piece of evidence states, I would ask him to reread it because I only heard that it would pass the House, in which case there is still no guarantee that this law will be passed. Let's jump back to the disadvantages for a few additional responses. Now, my second response under the two disadvantages is non-unique. They're already requiring warrants for all physical evidence that needs to be collected, which means this requirement already exists for a great majority of what goes on, and we don't see these disadvantages occurring. The second is that there are other means. There are always other means to go get warrants. Any agency can cooperate with another agency, and if one agency can't get a warrant, they can ask another agency to collect the evidence for them. That's how law enforcement works. Thirdly, is outweighed. Even if the SEC is hurt a little bit, and even if law enforcement is hurt a little bit, our advantages outweigh. They outweigh. So, let's, in these last 30 seconds, move into a couple voting issues. The first voting issues of this round, what I really want you to focus on when weighing this round right now. I have two. My first is comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. When you compare the status quo, which cannot improve itself in this round, to the world of the affirmative team, you get advantages with the affirmative team. And secondly, the only way you can go is up. Because the status quo is innocent and there is no proof that the affirmative team is going to hurt the status quo, the only way you can go is up, and that's by voting with the app. Thank you.
Starting negative corruption, we have 3 minutes and 10 seconds remaining.
Alright, so first I'm going to respond to everything that James just said in his last speech and then finally present some voting issues. So first let's look at the observations that James brought up. His first is that the AF believes the status quo is innocent. I have two responses. First, need evidence, not belief. Need evidence, not belief. The affirmative has not presented any evidence that the status quo is innocent, any evidence that everything is fine. All they said is that they believe the status quo is innocent. Well, that's great. I'm glad they believe that, but if there's no evidence to support that, then it has no bearing in the round. The second response you can tag as showing problems with case. Showing problems with case. When we were presenting all these problems, we were showing the problems with their case, not necessarily with the status quo, though we did present much evidence stating that the NSA has a lot of problems and is breaching privacy a whole lot. But what we were showing is that there were problems with their case, not the status quo. That wasn't our point. Now let's move on to the second observation, that of fiat power. And I have two responses. The first is only over agency and enforcement. Only over agency and enforcement. We agree. The affirmative team has fiat power, but only over their agency and their enforcement. And the NSA is not their agency and enforcement. It's just going to be an indirect part of the government that will be affected by their plan. They don't have fiat power over what the NSA does and does not do. Now next, he said, in that observation, he said, well, the NSA does obey the rules. But my response to this is he's provided no evidence. No evidence. He provided no evidence showing that the NSA does obey the rules, and so then you're weighing that over the two pieces of evidence we brought up showing that the NSA breaks the rules. Now let's look at the mandate 2 of the owner informed. He said, that he agreed secrecy is essential and the purpose is protection, and he agreed all of that. Now, my response to this is ignored rhetoric. Ignored rhetoric. What James failed to respond to here is the rhetoric under that, showing that since secrecy is essential to protection, and protection is the whole purpose, well then secrecy is always needed, so the mandate is completely irrelevant, won't do anything. And that was what the point was under those two arguments. And so if he just says, well, I agree that secrecy is important, he's not responding to the rhetoric and the logic behind that argument. Now let's move down to the disadvantages. He had three responses to those. The first was that it was a contradiction because companies are fighting back. I have two responses to this. First, then you are admitting inherency. Admitting inherency. James admitted by making that point and that argument against the disadvantage that companies are fighting back, that companies do require warrants, that their plan is completely inherent and has no need for you to pass it because companies are already taking that step. But my second response is you're in a double bind. You're in a double bind. By saying that we're in a double bind because we're making this contradiction because the companies are fighting back, then he's in a double bind. Because either the companies are fighting back or this disadvantage stands. And so either way, the affirmative team is the one who's losing here. Either they're inherent or this disadvantage of undermined security is still stands. And so they're the ones in a double bind, not us. We're just showing how by their logic, by passing their plan, you have one of these two options. Now his second response was that of non-unique, and he says, well, it's required with physical evidence. My response is electronic, not physical. We're talking about the SEC and the FTC's dealings with electronic and not physical evidence. If we were just talking about physical evidence, it would have nothing to do with this round, so this argument is irrelevant. Now his third point was that of other options. My response to this is no evidence. We have no evidence that the SEC or the FTC does have other options, and we have three pieces of evidence brought up in the round showing how it will completely hinder their job. They won't be able to do their job, and the Department of Justice, who would know what they're saying on that, was saying that the SEC wouldn't be able to accomplish what they want to accomplish if we pass this plan. Now, he said, okay, now I want to go to the voting issues. The first is that of inherency admitted. Inherency admitted. And this is...
Judge, my partner presented the first two advantages of our case. Now I'll continue with four additional advantages that you compare to the status quo. Now in this round, we're comparing the status quo to a cheeseburger. There's nothing wrong with the status quo. The cheeseburger is good. But the affirmative team gives you the burger plus bacon. Here's some more bacon, if you will, and three more advantages. Okay, advantage 3, strengthen foreign relations. Strengthen foreign relations, and this has two subpoints. Subpoint A, China is hostile. China is hostile, and this is from 2014. China's government is increasingly adopting a threatening posture towards top tech firms such as Google, Apple, and Microsoft over accusations regarding the NSA. Both the government and top Chinese businesses have already started to purge their networks of U.S. software and components. Next, subpoint B, Brazil is skeptical. Subpoint B, Brazil is skeptical, and this is from Fox News from 2014. The NSA spying scandal soured relations between Brazil and the U.S. The president of the Brazilian telecom company, Telebras, added that last year's revelations by Snowden forced Telebras to increase checks for security vulnerabilities and speed up Brazil's move to a technological self-reliance. So what we see here is that both privacy and protection are important to other nations. In the affirmative team's world, we're giving them what they want: increased privacy protection and positive change. Again, increased privacy protection and positive change. By focusing on these desires, we will be strengthening our foreign relations. Advantage for $180 billion. Advantage for $180 billion. In the status quo, U.S. companies are associated with the NSA as a result of the leaked information from Edward Snowden. Because of the affirmative team's limits on the United States federal government, our warrant for content standard will save money and protect the internet economy. This piece of evidence is from the New York Times from 2014. It's clear to every single tech company that this is affecting their bottom line, said Daniel Castro, a senior analyst. Forrester Research said that losses could be as high as $180 billion, or 25% of industry revenue. Next, moving on to Advantage 5, promotes business. Advantage 5 promotes business. One of the goals of the status quo is to maintain and improve our U.S. economy. As shown, privacy is important. The affirmative team plans to increase safeguards for privacy, which then attracts customers, consumers, and businesses to the United States. Again, this is from the New York Times article. Quote, we're hearing from customers, especially global enterprise customers, that they care more than ever about where their content is stored and secured, said John Frank at Microsoft. Mr. Castro said that most of the companies in this space are very frustrated because there hasn't been any kind of response that's made it so that they can go back to their customers and say, see, this is what's different now. You can trust us again. Now, with the affirmative team's change, companies can then show their customers how the United States federal government is increasing protection of their privacy rights using warrants. Now, all three of these advantages have one impact, that of America secured. Again, the impact of all of these advantages is America secured. The affirmative team's plan secures America through better foreign relations, an additional $180 billion in the internet economy, and a better environment that stimulates business. Now, we should all ponder these words by A. Philip Randolph, who was an African-American civil rights leader. Quote, justice is never given. It is exacted, and the struggle must be continuous, for freedom is never a final act, but a continuing, evolving process to higher and higher levels of human, social, economic, political, and religious relationship. So, unquote. So now that you have 3 more reasons to vote affirmative, I'll address what was presented in the 1NC. Now, first, 1NC's first argument was the companies fighting back, and I have 2 responses to this. You can tag my first response as increasing protection. That's increasing protection. Now, one of the things that Adrian talked about was encryption, which was asked in cross-examination. Encryption is not the same as a warrant for content standard. So what the affirmative team's doing is adding on to that protection, making it better, improving the system basically, and giving them that increased protection with the warrant for content standard. And the second response you can tag as we help the companies. We help the companies. Basically, what that encryption is showing is that the companies do want privacy, they do want protection, and therefore what we're doing is we're actually helping their cause. We're actually doing what the companies want and increasing protection for that, increasing protection in this instance with the ECPA. Next, let's go down to his point of inherency, talking about the EPA. You can tag my response as low probability. Low probability. Now, the reason why we don't want to wait for the EPA because it's a bill, and it doesn't necessarily have a guaranteed passage rate, and when you can instead vote for the affirmative team and have that guarantee that these mandates are going to be into effect in solving the problem. Now, I have a piece of evidence from GovTrack.us, and this is, it says that the bill, the Email Privacy Act, was introduced in May 7, 2013, and the prognosis is a 28% chance of being enacted. So as you can see, this is quite a rather old bill introduced in 2013. There hasn't been any action on it yet, and as we're in 2015, there's an even lower probability that's going to be enacted, and simply because if you can see your options, you have a very low chance with the EPA, or if you vote for the affirmative team's plan, you know that you will have those mandates enacted, and therefore you will get these advantages that was presented in both the 2AC and the 1AC. So therefore, please vote affirmative for that. Next, let's go up to his significance points, talking about search warrants. Now, his evidence was from the 6th Circuit Court, the Court of Appeals. You can tag my response as 6th Circuit only. 6th Circuit only. Now, one of the reasons why this is important, judges, because there are different courts of appeals depending on the geographic location in the United States. So there's more than one circuit, and the 6th Circuit only, the 6th Circuit decision, unfortunately, only affects the 6th Circuit jurisdiction. So only that section around that 6th Circuit. So the impact of this is still inconsistent. Still inconsistent. So as you can see, because that's only that one instance in the 6th Circuit, we have the rest of the United States that's still clouded by this inconsistency that we need to fix with the affirmative team's plan and increase our protection in that. Next, the issue of third-party doctrine. Third-party doctrine. Now, I have 3 responses to this. You can tag my first response as outdated. Outdated. Now, the evidence that Adrian brought up was about Supreme Court cases, and if you actually look at the date of those cases are around 40 years old. They're actually outdated. They're not very current, and for that reason, we need to make sure we have this action with the affirmative team's plan and ensure that we are protecting rights. Second response is outweigh. Second response is outweigh. Now, if you go back to cross-examination, Adrian was asked by James about whether or not case law versus common law. So basically, constitutional law, the law of the Constitution versus case law, such as Supreme Court cases, or the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. And Adrian basically said the constitutional law is the law of the land. Therefore, the affirmative team agrees with that. The Constitution should be held up above the rest of the legislation or other court cases So for that, please vote for the affirmative team because we're upholding the Constitution. Third response is that of improving system. So as you can see throughout this speech, and my partner's speech and my speech, when you compare the status quo to what the affirmative team gives you, we give you basically 5 advantages that the status quo cannot give you. We're basically improving the system with consistency and our advantages, and for those reasons, please vote for the affirmative team. Thank you.
Alright, great speech. Just have a couple of questions for you. Obviously, that's what
Yeah.
I'm up here for. So let's go and jump right in though. Starting off with the just your overall plan in general.
Yes.
What warrants or what are you requiring warrants for right now?
So
What's your plan?
So basically right now in the status quo, you don't need a full warrant for content. For the email, or however, if it was the document physical evidence, you would need a warrant.
Okay. So you're dealing specifically with emails with your plan?
Yes, correct.
Okay, now actually, could I get a copy of your plan, the one I see?
Yeah. One second.
Alright.
There you go.
Thank you. I just needed that for my speech reference. Alright, okay, now going down, talking about your, the argument that you ran up against my inherency point
Yes.
to EPA, you said
Yes.
low probability.
Correct.
You have a piece of evidence for that, right?
Yes.
What was the date on that?
I accessed that in 2014.
You accessed it.
Mhm.
What
It
was the
didn't-
date it was published?
It didn't have a date of publish.
Okay, so when was the bill introduced? Like the
It says in May 7, 2013.
Okay, so is it a safe bet that the evidence is from 2013?
At least.
Okay. So going down now, talking about the third-party doctrine. You had a couple of responses to that,
Yes.
of course, because it was pretty big.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and look at your first one. You said that that it's outdated evidence. Essentially, you're dealing with not the evidence itself, but the ruling, right?
Well, talking about the Supreme Court cases, though, those aren't very recent. Again, around 40 years old.
Okay, but you're talking about the rulings, not the evidence, right? Not the actual evidence.
Yeah, the goes court cases.
Okay. Now, is there a more recent ruling dealing with the third-party doctrine?
Now that's been brought up in evidence, so not on this round.
Okay, so the Supreme Court would look at the most recent ruling dealing with the third-party doctrine, right?
Theoretically, yes.
Okay. Now, your second response was dealing with the fact that it outweighs. Did you
Yeah.
talk about case and constitution law?
Correct.
All right. Now, isn't it true that the third-party doctrine is a constitutional rule?
No.
Okay, then what is it?
Basically, it's a doctrine, mainly a principle or idea, whereas with the constitutional law, it would be written into the Constitution of the amendments itself.
Okay, but it is true that it's not a constitutional amendment, but it is a constitutional rule. How our government views the Constitution.
It is in the opinion of the Supreme Court, but I don't think it's a rule in the Constitution.
But it's how the Supreme Court views the Constitution. That's what they use it as, right?
I guess you could say it was an interpretation.
Okay. So now, actually, I'm kind of jumping around here. You, in response to my warrants argument, you
Yeah.
just said the Sixth Circuit Court, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, actually, the Sixth Circuit evidence, could I get that back also? Unless, are you using it again?
I do not believe so.
Okay. Then I'm going to need that back for my speech.
I think it's...
This one? All right. Great. Okay. Now, did you respond to the second piece of evidence that I read dealing with search warrants, or just the one?
Not line by line, no.
Okay. Great. And actually, really quick, could I get the tagline for your fifth advantage?
Promotes business.
Promotes business? Okay, great. Then I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Negative picture.